I am here today with one of my best friends and somebody that I'm really excited to talk to, Jake from the Voluntary Life. Hey, Jake.
Hey, Stephanie. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's so much fun to do a podcast with you. Now, we decided to talk today because I heard and posted your talk on the Porc Therapy feed of at Libertopia 2013, where you spoke about ways to quit the rat race.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really great talk. I heard it twice, actually, because I got to give you feedback on it before you went prime time with it.
Yes, thank you.
But that talk was really cool and inspiring to me. And what it did, I think, was kind of crystallized most of the stuff that you talk about in the Voluntary Life podcast. It's a show that's about personal freedom, but I would say it really focuses more on the entrepreneurship angle or personal financial freedom. You definitely talk a lot about that kind of stuff. Saving, passive income, selling a business, starting a business. Those are all topics that come up on the Voluntary Life quite often. But your talk at Libertopia really kind of just condensed that down into a version for newbies. Like, if you've never heard anything about financial freedom before, if you're stuck in a job that you don't like, this talk is for you because it gives you like a really basic overview to potential strategies for getting financially free. And what you said is that you've interviewed a lot of people. You've done one of the strategies that you talked about, which was selling a business. And that's how basically you got financially free. But the other strategies you've learned about through talking to other people that were through your podcast or through the reading that you've done about it.
Yeah.
And one of the things I like about you is when you're interested in a subject, you'll read about it nonstop, like you voraciously read about it. And that sounds like one of the best ways to get to know about a certain topic. So you had a lot of info to share. And the strategies that you talked about at Libertopia for getting financially free were unjobbing, intensive saving, passive income, and selling a business.
Yes.
So today in our conversation, I want to just go a little more in depth and ask you some more detail about each of those.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but first of all, I mean, what would you say, like, if somebody's hearing this show before and maybe they haven't heard your talk or they haven't heard anything about financial freedom, like, how did you first, like, basically break out of the sort of cultural norms and, like, figure out that this was possible, first of all? And how would you define financial freedom? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, to start off with that question, when I first thought about this, I thought about it in terms of making loads of money and having the freedom that having loads of money provides. But actually, I think really financial independence or financial freedom, the best way that I can think of to understand it is to think of it in terms of what chance you have to do whatever you want with your time. The longer you have in time ahead of you that you don't have to do work that you don't want to do, then the more free you are to do anything you like with your time. And you can either choose to do that at a really high level of expenditure and, you know, spend loads of money on stuff, or you can do it quite frugally and, you know, live quite a frugal lifestyle. But the key thing to me is the time that you have until you have to work in a job that you don't want to do. That's what I sort of understand as real financial freedom. So, for example, there are some people who have quite high incomes. They may have a very good job, but they're stuck in a very high consumption lifestyle. And so they probably have mortgages to pay on large properties, and they have cars that they're still paying for, and they have the kind of lifestyle with friends and family that involves spending a lot of money on consumption items. And in order to do that, you have to keep earning. You've got to keep bringing in that high income. And that's not freedom, as far as I can see. That's actually quite stressful. So, you know, the idea for me is really to focus not on the amount of money, but on what your lifestyle is and what level of freedom you have to do whatever you want with your time. That's what I think the sort of most empowering kind of financial freedom that there is looks like.
Right. And so when you started, I mean, that takes courage, like you said in your talk. That is an unconventional way of living. it definitely was not something that I heard a lot about when I was growing up, right? It was like, to be successful, you get a steady job, one that brings in enough income so that you can pay your mortgage because you're going to buy a house, because you got to buy a house to have a family, and you got to get married and have kids and buy a house, and you're working to pay off your house for a while, and then you're working to pay off your cars and maybe your student loans, and
Yeah.
basically you're going to like expect to be in debt for the rest of your life. And even before I always sort of questioned that, one of the things that that I kind of thought of and started reading about when I was in high school was debt, and it was like, well, the less debt you could take on, the better, because you're going to have to pay it back at some point. And so I was able to get a scholarship to my undergrad that paid for my entire expenses, so I didn't have to pay anything for college, which was great. And I was really proud of that. But everybody around me was like, oh, it doesn't matter. Like this attitude, I worked really hard for the scholarship, but they had this attitude like, well, it doesn't matter. Like the student loans, everybody has them. Everybody else is in debt anyway. Why not? Kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so pervasive in the culture. And that was what I experienced going to college as well. I had a similar kind of experience to you, that I did postgraduate stuff only with scholarships that I could use to fund what I was doing, and I worked while I was doing postgraduate stuff as well. But I was able to get some scholarships, partly because my research was about Berlin in the 1990s, the property market there, and that was there was a lot of interest. So I actually got a private sector scholarship as well as a scholarship from the university that I did my PhD at. So I was able to go through and do a master's and a PhD without having any debt. And I actually saved during the period of doing that because I was working at the same time as doing so. But so many people who come out of undergraduate, I had undergraduate debts and I paid them down pretty quickly. But there's so many people who come out of undergraduate with just huge debts, and then also go on and take on even more debt in postgraduate university courses. And it sort of means that you end up at the start of your career completely on the back foot. You're already so totally in debt that your options are really quite limited in terms of thinking sort of creatively about entrepreneurship and stuff. You've got this heavy load that weighs on your mind. I think that really, really hinders people in terms of their options, the debt. And this is something that I think you've talked about before on your show, and we've talked about offline as well, that the price that you have to pay for college education now and what you actually get from it is so the value is so limited that I think the downsides of student debt really mean that I would seriously question it unless there's some very, very specific field that you absolutely want to go into that you have to get licensing for.
Yeah, I agree with you. It really, really affects your life, and it's almost like going into the military or something. Like the age of 18, you get convinced and you get kind of told your whole life up to that point that, oh, well, everybody's going to borrow these huge amounts of money to go to college. And it's just something you have to do because, then it's going to lead to success in the future. And you don't really understand it, but you kind of sign on the dotted line. And then, people end up going into huge amounts of debt. But it can be done way more cheaply. Not everybody can get a scholarship. Some people can, and that would be great. Some people have family members who save up money for them for college or something, so somebody else can pay for it, right? Some people have just cheaper ways to get an education, like going to a community college or vocational school or whatever. Usually those aren't so expensive with the tuition, and perhaps you can work at the same time to make some money to pay your tuition bills. So, and nobody says that's really easy or anything, but there are other options besides just taking out huge loans to go to college or graduate school.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also depends on what you choose to do in college as well, because there are some more directly applicable degrees that it's easier to get private sector scholarships for, and it's easier to get things that link up to companies that may be interested. I mean, I have friends doing sort of engineering-related subjects where that kind of thing is a lot more widespread. If you want to do something in humanities and stuff, it's a lot harder to find that kind of arrangement because those skills are not actually that directly applicable except in teaching. So, yeah, it depends on what degree you choose as well.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Now, I have a tough question for you, Jake.
Okay. I'm ready.
Okay. I think I know the answer to this question for myself, but kids.
Yes.
Kids are very expensive.
Yeah.
And I've seen calculations that say, each kid costs about, something like $300,000 to raise from like infancy to age 18 or something like that, and not even counting college or anything like that if you're going to pay for the college of a kid. So is financial freedom only for people who don't have kids and don't plan on having them?
I don't think so, because I would like to have kids, and but I do think that kids and the financial responsibility of kids is something that I think is really, really important to think about in terms of whether you're ready to do it and what effect it's going to have on you. Because it's another thing that people, I think, to a certain degree, stumble into and then realize, wow, now I really can't quit my job because I've got a young family and I've got a mortgage to pay and the car and
Right.
locked in. And so I personally believe that that is something to it's a wonderful thing to do if you want to do it, but I think it's something to plan for. And plan for financially, as well as obviously getting yourself together emotionally and being sure that you're in a position to be mature enough to have kids, which is another thing that I think a lot of people have kids way before they're really ready to be adults themselves.
Right.
I certainly know that I wasn't ready to have kids in my 20s when I was thinking of starting a business, emotionally or financially, but. For me, it's not a barrier, but it does. The financial side is not a barrier to having kids, but it does mean you have to plan for it as a serious expense and think about how you're going to take care of it. In my case, I chose to get into entrepreneurship before thinking about starting a family, and I really threw myself into the sort of building and a business and getting it to profitability and selling it first. There are other routes that other people can choose as well, but I think one of the things that I think is really important is to start early, to really look at what you're trying to do. If you want to work towards financial independence, to really get on with that project as quickly as possible in your life, because the earlier that you start, the more opportunity you have to plan your finances so that when you do have kids, the ideal situation for me is to be able to actually take time when you have kids. That's the most important thing, I think, is not so much that are you going to have money for lots of comfortable toys. It's really about whether or not both the parents are going to be able to actually spend time with their kids, because the time is what really matters. But that's what people don't feel they can afford to do. They end up being a mum and a dad who both go out and both work and put their kids in daycare. Barely
have to keep working to afford the daycare.
Right, they get stuck in that process where they're working all the time to afford that lifestyle they've got stuck in. The alternative is that you try and get to a position of financial independence and flexibility where you can either through unjobbing, where you have a flexible lifestyle, or through intensive saving or selling a business or whatever it is, but you get to a point where you can actually plan to have significant time to spend with your kids. Because otherwise, really, why have kids if you don't have time to spend with them? Then it just seems it seems like a crazy decision to me.
Right, exactly. And unfortunately, most people don't plan, not to that level, but not at all.
Yeah.
Most people don't plan at all for their kids. It's not funny, actually. It's really tragic, because who does that affect? Well, the kids. I mean, they lose out on a lot. And I've heard a lot of stuff said about how basically one of the worst financial decisions you could make for yourself is having a child as a teenager, right? But I mean, it's also one of the worst emotional decisions too.
Absolutely.
You're not ready. I almost, I almost want to say I don't care who you are. Like having the emotional maturity as someone who's younger than 20 to have a kid is, I would say, incredibly rare. So yeah.
I was just going to say another thing about that is also, I think that if you don't really feel like having kids is one of those things that if you don't really feel incredibly committed and positive and this is something that is absolutely something that you're really enthusiastic about doing, then I think it would be much better for a lot of people to just simply not have kids.
Right.
Unfortunately, people do have kids because they think that's what you do and that's the sort of societal norm.
Right.
I think a lot of people would be far, far happier not having kids. And of course, they are going to be they're not going to become bad parents if they don't actually have them. So I think it's a wonderful thing to do, but unfortunately, I think a lot of people do it just because they think they should, or they think that's kind of the next step in life, that, oh, well, you may as well do that then. And that, I think, is a terrible motivation to have kids.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's important to include that in the discussion about just freedom in life in general, because, ideally, what you'd like is to be financially free so you can do what you want. If you're going to have kids, be financially free at the point when you have them so that you can spend time with them because that's what you want to do and that gives you a lot of joy. Not the idea that you're kind of either chained down to making money to pay for them or chained down to spending time with them when you don't really want to spend time with them. Those are two situations I think we could think about avoiding.
Yeah, absolutely. And being financially free doesn't necessarily mean that you never have to work again or anything. But as an example, 2 examples, let's say that you set up a passive income business. So let's say you spend maybe 4 or 5 years, you're really getting your business off the ground, you have a couple of online websites selling digital products of whatever kind they are, you do a lot of hard work, you really get it going, maybe you encounter some problems, you work out, change your model a bit, and so forth. After that initial period when you've put loads and loads of work in, then if you've done a good job and you've got a passive income going, then you're going to be able to reap the benefits of that, which is that you will be able to have a much more flexible lifestyle. So you may need to do a bit of work to keep maintaining and keep sort of the interest in your products going, but you won't be working anything like as hard as you did initially, because that's the whole point of a passive income business. You've kind of set the thing up to give you a continuing income stream, and then you can use that time to really devote, if you do want to have kids, to your family. And another alternative would be unjobbing. If you find different ways of getting income, doing things that you really love, and you find some flexibility in doing that, and not necessarily stuck to a 9-to-5 job that you have to go into, but maybe you can work from home and do other things, then with your partner you can work out, well, who's going to do a bit of work on which days, and how can we organise it so that we always have enough time to feel that we're both really involved in the kids' upbringing.
Right, yeah. So another question that's kind of related to that, you talked about strategies to quit the rat race and,
Yes.
Unjobbing, passive income, intensive savings, selling a business. We can talk a little bit more about each one of those in detail. But a thought that occurred to me is there another
way?
Is there another way? Yeah. And what that other way that I was thinking of could be is becoming a stay-at-home parent a way to quit the rat race, and essentially maybe relying on a spouse or something like that to basically, provide income. And being somebody who doesn't worry about that at all, whether you're a woman or a man, is that a way to quit the rat race? Obviously, your spouse can't quit the rat race, but would you be able to do it that way?
Well, I suppose that I would view the whole family unit as the economic unit in that case, if you see what I mean, right?
Uh-huh.
So yeah, I mean, if the one of the whichever partner it is, like the man or the woman, is just not having to work because they're essentially being the main child caregiver, then that's cool. But the question is, well, what's the other person doing? You know, and
Right.
that really is the key. So I would say, you know, it's the family that's the economic unit, and you've still got to solve that problem. Okay, well, what is the guy or the woman, depending on who it was, what are they going to do, and how is that going to actually support the family as an economic unit? But
Right,
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think it's cool if two people decide, okay, well, one person's going to be the primary caregiver and going to be staying at home more, and the other person is going to do more work. Fine, if that works for them, and if one person wants to keep going into a not having quit the rat race type job and they're happy to do that, okay, that I guess that can work out. But I personally think there's you know, it's great for everyone to look at how they can be more liberated in their own time and not have to sort of fit into well-trodden paths of jobs.
Yeah, cool. Okay, great answer. So, all right.
But I would always be interested to hear other ways that people have thought of getting freedom from the jobbing lifestyle, because I think that all the stories I've heard, you can pretty much fit them into the 4 different routes that I was talking about. And obviously, there are lots of people who combine 2 things. So someone might do a passive income business and then sell the business, or someone might be unjobbing but also start a passive income business as part of their unjobbing. So there's ways of combining these 4 different strategies. But at least everything I've heard so far, to me, seems to pretty much fit into those 4 different routes. But I'm super curious, you know, if you or anyone else thinks of other routes, then that would be awesome. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah. Oh, I was I was just thinking of other potential routes to quit the rat race, and
Yes.
you know, I know I know a couple of people. I asked about the stay-at-home parent thing because I know some people who have basically done that. You know, they were working in a career, and then they, you know, maybe got married and had some kids, and now they're a stay-at-home parent. So, okay.
Yeah, and I think that's a totally viable choice to make, particularly if that's what you get fulfillment from. There are people who really do get fulfillment from that, but they've still got to solve the problem of what their partner does in terms of the economic unit as the family as a whole.
Right, right. Well, yeah, in that case, they're getting paid. Basically, they're getting maybe not paid directly, but like they're being taken care of in exchange for doing something that they really love, which doesn't feel like work to them. So
Yeah.
kudos if they can do that. The other thing that I thought about, the other creative, potentially rat race quitting strategy was voluntary poverty. Basically, the people who go and live in a yurt and live off the land and grow all their own food and basically try to literally take their expenses down to zero and not pay any taxes, and essentially sometimes they'll claim to be agorists, but not really. I mean, because they're not really doing any economic activity, let alone counter-economic. But what do you think about that? Just the abject poverty style of financial freedom.
Well, I think, you know, for people who want to do unjobbing, I mean, just to briefly sort of restate what I mean by unjobbing. So unjobbing is where you decide that you're not going to take any kind of career deferring your life type plan into account. You're not going to say, okay, I'm going to study for 8 years doing something I hate because eventually I'll be making enough money and I'll be happy, or I'm going to do this for a long time and work my way up the ladder, which I hate, because eventually I'll be happy. The unjobbing route is to just not do that and to always do stuff that you love, and to sort of basically choose a life where you're only working on things that you really love, that you gain a huge amount of fulfillment from, and therefore it's not really work because you love doing it anyway. And there are a lot of people, if they take that approach, they're going to have to go for voluntary poverty in at least a short term, because it may just happen to be that the things they love doing do not really make very much money at all in the marketplace. And the only way that they're going to be able to do that is to effectively live a life of radical simplicity and radical kind of like extreme minimalism, if you like. And
Right.
I think it's a valid choice. It's not my choice. And there are definitely sort of downsides. And I think it's hard to sustain long term, particularly as you get older. So, I mean, like any choice, you have to decide whether or not that's something that really works for you and whether it's going to work for you in the long term. It's not my choice, but I think it's a completely valid way of doing what you love. And in many ways, you know, if you're willing to live a really, really simple and very, very low income life, then it opens up the possibilities of what you can do because you have such low expenses to support. So obviously there's grades of it as well. You don't necessarily have to go and live, you know, in a yurt. We can all probably lower our expenses a bit, you know, without really changing.
Without going into the woods. Not just yet.
Exactly. And it's certainly true that lowering expenses is more effective than increasing income. It really is. It's something to really think about. That if you and that is up to a point, but for most people, lowering expenses is actually going to give you more of a boost than increasing your income, because as you increase your income, and then it's harder to save tax, you're going to move into higher tax brackets, and so on and so forth. So lowering your expenses gives you a lot of bang for your bucks in terms of financial freedom. So I think it's a valid choice to consider, and there are definitely sort of different levels that you can go to, but it's one fundamental way that a lot of people choose the unjobbing route is to basically live a life of voluntary poverty.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what I'm hearing is it's a choice. It's not everybody's choice, but it is a valid choice.
Yeah, and you've just got to live with the consequences, which is obviously that it's harder in the long term to sustain yourself if you're living. Let's say that you move to some extremely low cost place in the world, like you go and live in a very, very low cost country like India or South America or something like that, and you choose to do something that doesn't make you a huge amount of money, but it brings you, but you love doing it. So let's say that you're a musician, or I don't know, whatever it is, right? And
at least it's warm out in that yurt.
Right. And that funds your lifestyle that you enjoy. And there are lots of people who choose to do that, and it's fine. It's just that then you got to think, okay, well, for example, if we want to have kids, how are we going to actually do that, and how much is this going to be a viable, practical thing to do into the future as we're getting older, and that kind of consideration. So for me, it's not the lifestyle that I would choose, but it's totally valid.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so this reminds me of another question. I had a friend post your episode of The Voluntary Life on Facebook, and it was the one where your Libertopia talk was featured, where you talked about what we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
And she had a couple of, she's I guess maybe we can consider herself a skeptic. And she had a bunch of questions about it. She was like, I really want to do this, but I'm just not sure if it's really like attainable or possible. One of the questions that she raised was the one about voluntary poverty that I just brought up. And she said, I've been poor, and I didn't feel very free when I was poor, so I don't want to be poor again. She works in a job that, it's like a conventional kind of 9-to-5 type job that I don't know if she particularly super enjoys, but it's paying the bills, and she likes having money. But the other thing she brought up, which I thought was kind of important and interesting, is basically, do you have to be a sleaze or a salesman or a character kind of like Tim Ferriss, or maybe some of the other people that talk about passive income, or they're doing a lot of marketing, often for their own products, and they can come off as not very authentic or not very genuine. So I want to hear your thoughts on that. Do you have to be a sleaze?
In order to do what? To create a passive income business, or to be financially free in general?
Both, but mostly to have passive income, or to have your own business, be an entrepreneur.
I think there's definitely two approaches to this, and I know I think I can understand where your friend is coming from. so one approach is to identify a product that there's a gap in the market, and to do some market research, and see exactly how to position it to try and effectively make as much money as you can in as quick a time as possible. And the 4-Hour Workweek, Tim Ferriss's book, has got loads of suggestions about how you do that, and it is completely calculating that approach. And I don't mean that as a criticism, it's just a fact. It's a very, very calculating approach as to how to set up a passive income business. The purpose of that business is simply to give you a passive income, and you kind of almost don't really care anything else about it, apart from some, obviously, don't land up in jail or something like that. But it's essentially like, okay, this is just a calculating aim to get me passive income. Mm-hmm. You can totally do that, and I don't think that there's anything morally wrong with that. I personally, I can't get the enthusiasm together to really build that kind of passive income business, because I wouldn't believe in it. I wouldn't actually find it fulfilling. I wouldn't have a sense of purpose from doing it. The business that I started, I was really passionate about. I absolutely believed in, and I thought it was really important to make the world a better place for pedestrians. I thought that the way that street networks and shopping centres are designed is just atrocious at the moment, and that there's a huge opportunity being missed for creating better environments that are easier to find your way around, that are easier to use, and therefore are also generating more value for retailers and so forth. And so I that is what got me out of bed in the morning. That's what gave me the energy to create the business. And because I really believed in it, I was really enthusiastic about it, and because I could see that there was a real chance of bringing improvements to people's lives in what we were doing, I was able to sell and not be embarrassed about it. I was able to absolutely talk about why what we're doing was so valuable and important. And I think that the problem that people have with selling is when they're embarrassed by what they're doing because they don't really believe in it. Then it's incredibly hard to sell. I can't do it myself if I don't actually believe in what it is I'm selling. I just don't have the motivation to sell. But if you're creating a business that you believe in and that you think is going to make people's lives better, even if what you're doing is not necessarily like earth-shatteringly different, but it's just going to make people's lives better, and you know it. You know in your heart that this is actually going to be a much better way for people to do X, Y, and Z, whatever that is. Then you're going to be able to sell because you won't feel embarrassed by what you're doing. You feel proud of it, and it's absolutely possible to build a successful business like that. For me, that was the energy that built my business, and that was where I got my motivation from.
I see, yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm hearing you don't have to be a sleaze.
No,
obviously.
You don't have to be a sleaze.
Yeah, I mean, when I thought about just you personally, there's no way, I don't think anyone could ever describe you as sleazy or, Thank you. of that ilk. And you've had financial freedom, so I feel encouraged that it's absolutely not necessary to be a sleaze.
No, but there is definitely a cultural barrier about selling that, everyone, I guess because in school we just don't have any real relationship with marketplace trading and marketplace interactions, and we do have a lot of interaction with hierarchical relationships with teachers and staff, and often family relationships are like that too. So unfortunately there is a cultural barrier that people still have about selling, where they feel like that they are kind of doing something sleazy if they're selling, and that is something that I also had to really learn how to sell in the beginning. I really did. And I did find it. And there is also the thing of the fear of rejection, right? That people, they talk about it being sleazy, but one of the things I think people are afraid of too is that if you go out there and really pour your heart and soul into a business and try and sell something, and then you get sort of sound of crickets in response, that's going to be painful, because that's kind of like feeling rejected. And So I think,
but it's also valuable feedback, because what you're hearing is, this, you haven't filled a hole in the market that really needed to be filled, right? You haven't added value.
Exactly. So I think that's something that everyone has to go through if they want to get into setting up a business as well, is to really have a kind of change of heart or change of mind about selling, and sort of confront some of the bad conditioning that I guess we've all had about selling being bad and it being sleazy and so forth. And of course there are sleazy people out there and stuff, but I think selling also gets a really bad name in general, when really if you're going to provide something that other people is going to make other people's lives better, then actually it's a great thing to sell what you're selling, because you're actually helping people. So I think there is a change of perspective there that also is quite important to go through.
Right. Yeah, I love that answer. It's about how you look at it, and if you believe your product is really adding value, like, that'll probably come through in how you're expressing yourself about it.
Exactly.
Cool. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about intensive saving just for a minute, because this is something that I haven't heard much about. Like, I remember, a few times in my life just kind of hearing like a blip on the radar when I was really young, like maybe, like 12 years old. I heard something that said, well, if you put away like $8 a week starting right now, kiddies, then you'll be a millionaire by age 50 or something like that. And this is about compound interest. And so I totally started, I had like a little bank account where I put like a few bucks a week in it, or, whatever I got when I was that age. And, I was trying to learn about compound interest. It didn't really go anywhere. Like, I can't remember what happened, but like, that bank went out or something. Like, I got the money out, but I didn't keep up with that account since I was 12.
You haven't gone back and found £1 million sitting in the account.
No. Oh, that would be great. But no, I haven't. So, like I heard that idea several times, that like you can use compound interest to your advantage. And I learned about the mathematical formulas for it. But saving, gosh, there's every incentive, especially in America, right? Because, we've had the interest rates set by the Federal Reserve that go down all the time. And when you factor inflation, or the real rate of inflation into it, it's probably like, it totally does not make sense to have money sitting in the bank. It's literally vanishing. It's inflating away. Yeah. It's like a demurrage fee. That's just, if you're not spending it, it's just sitting there, and it's getting smaller and smaller. So sometime around maybe 2008, I started realizing this, and I was like, I think I'm going to buy some precious metals with this money I have sitting in the bank. And so I did, and I was really glad about that. And then, some point later, like a few years after that, maybe, I found out about sort of the permanent portfolio approach. And that made a lot of sense, because it's basically, the basic idea, and this is from Harry Browne. He was a famous, libertarian writer, and wrote about all kinds of aspects of personal freedom, actually, which I'm kind of surprised about, that he was active with the Libertarian Party. You don't often see people who are in the Libertarian Party so interested in personal freedom, but he was, and he wrote about relationships and financial freedom and all kinds of stuff. But what he recommended was this permanent portfolio approach, where you split up your assets basically between equally 25% gold, stocks, bonds, and cash. And then when one goes up, the others may go down, or vice versa, and you kind of periodically rebalance. And when one goes up, you just buy some of whatever's low.
Exactly.
And now, here's a question, Jake. Do you think if Harry Browne were alive today, do you think he might add a fifth one and say, okay, have 20% in gold, 20% stocks, 20% bonds, 20% cash, and 20% Bitcoin?
Well, it depends on what your objectives are from a permanent portfolio. I don't think Harry Browne would add Bitcoin to the permanent portfolio yet. and I'll explain why. But just to back up a little bit and sort of respond to some of the other things that you said about saving. So yeah, the way that it should work is that you should just be able to put your money in a bank, and your money should earn interest, and that interest should compound so that the interest also starts earning interest. And if you keep adding to your savings, that's a great way to build up your potential for financial independence in the future. That's how.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're always going one way. It's almost like fitness, right? Like you're either getting fatter or you're getting thinner.
Right.
Right. And which direction, it doesn't matter if you're going just a tiny bit in each direction. Over time, it's going to add up and you're going to go in that direction.
Yeah. And a lot of people think of it in terms of, well, why should I bother putting aside, $1,000 or $3,000, whatever, because like that's not really going to add up to very much. But with the compounding of interest, it really can add up. And it's a very, very powerful tool. So that's how it should work. The problem is, the two problems, especially for us today. Firstly is that there's a hidden tax called inflation. So you effectively, your money itself is having value drained out of it because the government, through various institutions, is effectively printing more money. And so that's one problem, is that we have this hidden tax that drains out value from the money itself, and means that the same dollar or pound won't buy you as much year on year. And then there's this other problem that we've got, which you mentioned, especially at the moment, which is that we live in a time of what's called financial repression. And what that is where interest rates are being held extremely low. So central banks in America and the UK and lots of other places are deliberately keeping interest rates far lower than they otherwise would be if on a free market. And they do this by manipulating bond sales and various other things. So the effect of this is that if you are saving, firstly, value's being drained out of your money through inflation, and secondly, you're not getting the compounding because interest rates are being held so low. Mm-hmm. So if you want to benefit from that opportunity, then you have to look to not just saving cash, but find other ways of having a portfolio of savings or investments that then are going to give you the opportunity to compound your interest over time. And the permanent portfolio is one strategy, and I think it's a really, really great strategy. So when it comes to the permanent portfolio, the thing about the permanent portfolio is it's not designed because of any... Well, let me put this another way. There's basically two ways of looking at markets. You either think that you can predict what's going to happen, or you don't, right? And pretty much all investment advice falls into one of those two camps, right? If you think that you can predict what's going to happen, then you think you can buy things because they're going to increase in value, and you buy this asset now and then another asset later, and you think you know the future, right? And there's another approach, which is to say, okay, I don't know what's going to happen. And the permanent portfolio is based on that approach. And the reason that those four asset classes are in the portfolio is because although we don't know what's going to happen, we can imagine different scenarios in the economy. And those different scenarios broadly come down to either we're going to have growth, so the economy is either going to be growing or it's going to be shrinking, or we're going to have recession. And in that growth, either we're going to have inflationary growth, where the money supply is increasing, or we're going to have deflationary growth, where the money supply is not increasing, it's shrinking. And you're going to have a recession, either with increasing money supply, inflation, or with decreasing money supply. If you put all those together, you come out with essentially four different economic scenarios, and these four asset classes are best suited for these four scenarios. So gold is really, if you have real inflation, then the gold is very useful for that. The stocks are for if you have real prosperity. The cash is if you have a tight money recession. And the bonds are if you have a long-term depression with interest rates being held low as they are now. So that's the sort of idea behind the design of the permanent portfolio. Now, why would you put another asset class in? Well, you put another asset class in if you thought that there was an economic condition where this asset class is only going to benefit, or is going to be the one that benefits most, and the others are going to be coming into problems. Now, if you happen to think that Bitcoin is a great bet for the future and that money is going to move into Bitcoin and that it's going to be a great opportunity, then by all means, you can invest in Bitcoin. But that's what Harry Browne would have called a variable portfolio, which is essentially you say, hey, I think this is going to happen. I'm putting a bet on this. This particular, in this case, Bitcoin is going to increase in value. Or it might be that you say, I reckon this stock is going to increase in value. Or I have a real feeling about silver. I think that's going to increase or whatever. And you invest in that in the variable portfolio. You wouldn't put it into the permanent portfolio unless it was clear that there was one particular economic condition that Bitcoin would be the asset that would benefit from. I guess you could say that Bitcoin may start to take the place of gold in the future, because it is far more easily transportable. So maybe that's what's going to happen. Also, I guess you could say maybe Bitcoin will start to take the place of cash, because Bitcoin is like a kind of mixture between gold and cash in terms of the way that it's used. But at the moment, it's not yet. I think Bitcoin's basically, it's too soon for it to be clear what it's going to do relative to the other assets to put it in there. So I would consider it to be a speculation at the moment. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with speculating, but it's not quite the same thing as the approach, which is to say, okay, well, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I do want to have, I do want to be protected for each economic condition. And if that's the case, then you kind of need to be able to identify, well, why would you hold any of these assets? It is still really early days with Bitcoin. So there's lots of things that could happen. I think I think it's really exciting, and I think it's a really awesome invention. And I'm really happy that Bitcoin exists, and I'm really interested in Bitcoin. But I would call it a speculation at this point.
Yeah. So basically, the idea is that the permanent portfolio, or the money and assets that you have in the permanent portfolio, are meant to be safe, and whatever happens economically within that group, within that portfolio, you're going to be fine.
Yeah, exactly. That's the goal is not to beat the market. The goal is to effectively just make sure that you are going to be absolutely fine whatever happens in the economy, insofar as it's ever possible to be fine. Obviously, there's no guarantees in this world, but this is, at least to my mind, that's the approach that I personally think is the safest.
Yeah, so maybe you might have money that's kind of outside of that you're willing to play around with, that maybe you'd put into more speculative kinds of investments.
Exactly, and that is exactly what Harry Browne suggested as well. And how much of your money you put into speculative investments is entirely up to you. Maybe you want to be extremely speculative, and maybe you think that you really have such a hot tip as to what's going to happen in the future because you think that you've worked something out. That's fine, but it's still your speculation, and you still don't know, and so consequently, you are risking it in a different kind of way than you are with a more strategic and automatic kind of portfolio adjustment that you have, like with the permanent portfolio.
Yeah. So why is silver speculative?
Well, the problem with silver is just that it's the idea with silver is it's a similar thing to gold in that if there is a very inflationary period, then silver it also is used as a monetary metal, and it is also used to hedge against inflation. Silver is complicated by the fact that there are far more industrial uses for it than gold. So the nice thing about gold is that it's really well established as an inflation hedge and as a monetary metal. Silver is that, but it's also other things, and consequently the silver market can be influenced by other factors as well. So that's why I think the suggestion that Harry had was to use gold rather than silver, was because it's more clear what gold is going to do if there is a really inflationary period. And as far as I can see, silver is also, because it's a smaller market, it's been more manipulated in the past as well. It's been possible for a few people to to make really big moves in the silver market and do strange things to the price.
Yeah, I gotcha. Okay, so I want to switch gears. That's really helpful to talk about the permanent portfolio. Actually, maybe one more question.
Sure.
I mean, how would somebody pull off like the rate of intensive saving of 50, saving 50% or 75% of their income? Obviously, it's got a lot to do with minimizing expenses, but it also takes the ability to resist social pressure, to almost maybe to not care, about keeping up with the Joneses and so forth. So, I mean, do you have any advice there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to do there is to get involved with some of the communities of people who talk about doing this, because you can go and read journals of people who are doing exactly this. And the two websites that I know about where a lot of people talk about this, one is called Early Retirement Extreme. So you can look at that website, and lots of people write their journals about how they're doing it. And another one is called Mr. Money Moustache. So you can go there and look at that website. And they're both really interesting. And, I mean, some of the things to think about are, for example, people look at transport costs, in particular cars, and they try and minimize that, so they try and use a bike instead. And they try and live in areas. They look at housing costs, so they try and look at where they can locate, which is going to be a good quality of life, but not super expensive rents, particularly if they're doing jobs that are more online or flexible and so forth. And there's lots and lots of other sort of things that you can get into. I'm not an expert on intensive saving, but I've learned a huge amount by just reading about the different lifestyle choices of these people. As it happens, I've never owned a car, and in Brighton you can walk it everywhere anyway. So there are some things that have just like been kind of natural to me. But I guess you could summarize it by saying the way that you do intensive saving is to as you progress in your career, you just don't increase your consumption. That's really the key, is like you basically live like a student and earn.
Keep living like a student.
Keep living like a student. That's basically the idea. Keep living like a student and just bank the money. And that's sort of what people are doing. And then obviously not literally just put it in a bank, but then you put it into whatever you consider to be a safe, diversified portfolio and so forth. But I've learned a huge lot. And I have to say, like one of the things that we've been doing over the summer, because we're going traveling, planning to do more traveling, is I have looked at what I can sell of my stuff on eBay. I'm amazed at how much crap I had lying around that I wasn't even aware of, that I've sold that had value that I wasn't aware of. I'm just talking about some clothes that I don't really use that much, and old electronics that are like I had an old iPod and various like things like that are just sitting around that I've sold now, and old books that I've sold. And these are the kinds of things that individually they're all small change, but it's sort of like a mentality that people who are adopting that approach have, which is to just really kind of think in how they can live a principled minimalist lifestyle, and how frugal living can be kind of a part of your value system if you believe in it, and if you really are excited and enthusiastic about the potential for financial independence. And if you see this as your way of doing it, then I think it can be an extremely rewarding thing to do. If it's just like, oh God, I don't know how on earth I would save all that money, that sounds like a real pain in the ass, then obviously you're not gonna enjoy that lifestyle. So it's one choice, and it's only one of the sort of ways of doing it. But if you think it's something that you can get into and get into that mindset, I'd really encourage you to go and look at the Mr. Money Moustache and Early Retirement Extreme websites, and read some people's journals where they talk through all of the sort of little victories they've had and the struggles they've had, and how they're thinking about saving more money on this, that, and the other. And people share tips and they exchange ideas. And that kind of networking, I think, is also really helpful. Get advice from other people and share your own thoughts with other people about how you maybe can save more money in different ways.
Yeah, that sounds like something you have to be motivated to do and to enjoy. I was thinking of somebody who wrote an article once that I read on my show Porc Therapy about being a war tax resistor, essentially, like now, recently, and how he basically took a volunteer, like he quit his job. It was paying him $100,000 a year, had a very high paying job. He quit, and now he's doing consultant work, and he makes, $20,000 a year. And his goal is to stay under that line where he has to pay any taxes.
Right.
So that's what's motivating him. And he really gets a lot of fulfillment out of that, even though he does live a very student-like minimalist lifestyle. But he said he was surprised because he thought he would be literally digging for grubs and not able to afford food and trying to pick wild berries outside. But actually, he said, and this is even in the Bay Area of California, so it's that's not exactly an area with a low cost of living. He said he's able to do it, and one of the ways is by just riding a bike, and he had all these tricks, but he was able to pull it off, and it wasn't as bad as he thought. So yeah. I think it can be done, just with a little creativity and the desire to do so.
And this is the thing that I think people think about it in terms of oh God, do I have to live like a real in abject poverty if I want to do this? And like you were mentioning, someone's had that concern on Facebook about the idea of sort of extreme saving or intensive saving. I think one of the things to say about it, my experience, and I'm sure that this is going to be the same for other people too because of the culture we live in, my experience is that we live in such an insanely high consumption and financially wasteful culture that the opportunity to be more frugal there's so many ways of doing it that are not going to massively impact on. Well, they're not going to impact on your happiness at all. There's lots of ways of saving money that you're still going to have a fulfilled and enjoyable life because
it's not that hard.
It's not that hard. It really isn't because we're all so wasteful. I mean, really, in the way that the culture works at the moment. And that's there's nothing morally wrong with that. If people want to waste their money, they can do, but it's just it's a missed opportunity. There's a huge opportunity to save money, and so you even if you're only going for the low hanging fruit and the easy ways that you can save some money, there's everyone I think can benefit from looking into that.
All right. Well, Jake, thank you so much for talking about this with me. I really appreciate your expertise. And where can people find you online?
Thank you. They can find me at thevoluntarylife.com, and links to all the social media is there. So that's where you can sign up to the podcast and connect with me on various social media.
Thank you so much. I always really appreciate hearing what you have to say as someone who's not only lived this, but read a lot about it and has some special experience with the topic. So thanks once again, Jake, from The Voluntary Life, and we'll see you next time.